as Martina said, my name is Peter and my pronouns are he and him. And this webinar is called Embracing Everybody's Normal LGBTQIA plus identities in ELT. As a bit of a caveat before I start, I just want to say that this is a safe space. It's a respectful place, because of course, if you know the sorts of things that are happening around the world, not just in the UK and the US, but there have been a lot of difficult narratives, especially against LGBTQIA plus people. So I'd like to keep it respectful and safe. Another caveat is that the things that I'm going to share are not necessarily appropriate for every single market. There are some markets that criminalize LGBTQIA plus people, and so I would never really recommend using the materials that I'm going to show and share in those particular places, because it may well be unsafe for the teacher, it may well be unsafe for the students. And for me, as an educator, I want to make sure that everyone is safe. That is the first thing. But I also would like to see everybody being represented. So with that being said, I'm going to move on, if it's going to let me move on. There we are. So Martina will know this quote, I believe. This is a quote I use quite often. And this is something for you to mention in the chat. So I'd like you to read this quote, "You cannot be what you cannot see." And I'd like you to write in the chat what you understand by this particular quote. What does it say to you? Because I have my own ideas, and we're all different people, and people may have different ideas to me. So if you're happy to do so, please write in the chat what you understand by this particular quote. While that's happening, I can tell you a little bit about Marian Wright Edelman. She is an American activist, particularly for children's rights and for civil rights as well. She was born in 1939, as you can see there, and she's still with us. This particular quote comes from a documentary called Misrepresentation, and I would thoroughly recommend watching it, especially if you're interested in gender equality and gender diversity. Now, if you have no ideas about what this quote might mean, that's absolutely fine. For me, it means, oh, there we go. Thank you, Scott. If a person does not have examples of someone doing something like a job, it's very difficult to imagine yourself doing that job. Absolutely. So it's kind of not having a role model as such, not seeing someone that can do something. I don't know or see something. Yes, I'm not aware of what it may entail. Absolutely. Visibility is vital. Visibility is important. Absolutely. And later on in this webinar, I'll tell you a little bit of my background in the UK, where you can't be what you can't see was something that really affected me quite strongly. So yes, thank you for that. So I apologize for the bright yellow. I didn't realize how bright it would actually be, but hopefully it might keep attention. So in this session, I wanted to keep it very simple. So there are really 4 parts to this: why, how, what, and the conclusion. So we're going to start off with why. And I have a little quiz here for you. Now, this information comes from Just Like Us, who are a charity in the UK, and they do various reports on LGBT plus community in the UK. And one of their most recent reports was called Growing Up LGBT plus, and this was published in 2021. So they're looking at 2020 and people's experiences in 2020. And this was mainly about LGBT plus people in education. And I usually have this as just plain statistics, but I thought it might be quite fun to have a guess at what these percentages might be. So if we look at the first question, what percentage of LGBT plus students heard negative language about being LGBT plus in the past year? So that's in 2020. Remember, these are students in the UK. So that's question 1. We have 60%, 1 to 30%, 70%, 80%. We're not quite there yet. 90%. I think you're probably the closest. The actual percentage is 91%. So 91% of LGBT plus students in England heard negative language about being LGBT plus in the year 2020. Let's look at the second question. What percentage of LGBT plus school pupils were bullied in the past year? Again, that's 2020. So we have 60, 85, 70, 97%. Yes, optimism. It can be, I think we can be a little bit more optimistic on this one, although perhaps not if we compare it with question 3. Actually, the percentage of LGBT plus school pupils that were bullied is 42%. So just under half. I mean, it's still not good. There should be no percentage, 0% that are bullied, no matter who they are, no matter what identity they have. But still, 42% is a lot. And the third question, so a direct comparison here, what percentage of non-LGBT plus school pupils were bullied in the past year? So remember, LGBT plus bullied 42%. We've got 15, we've got 20, 55, 25, 20. Oh, not too bad, not too bad. So this one is exactly half of the LGBT plus school pupils, so 21%. Again, still not great figures, but potentially these figures do show people that LGBT plus students are more at risk at school. They're more at risk of hearing negative language. And in a more recent study done by Just Like Us, LGBT students are very much less positive about the future in comparison to their non-LGBT plus counterparts. So it's kind of difficult to imagine what LGBT plus students may go through. However, as a gay person, as a queer person growing up in the 80s and in the 90s in the UK, we had a lovely law. And this was called Section 28. Now, if you don't come from the UK, you may not have heard of this. That's absolutely fine. There may well be laws in other countries that are fairly similar. But this was started by Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Prime Minister, and she brought it in 1988. And within this law, it said and this is a direct quote, that a local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality. They shall not promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. What gets me about this particular phrasing is the acceptability as a pretended family relationship. Of course, this was in 1988, but it's not 1888. And this law remained in place in Scotland until the year 2000, and in England and Wales in 2003 is when it was stopped. So throughout my educational career, from mid-80s until 2000, when I finished university, it was covered by this law. So that means that I had, and many, many other people, had no role models about what being, in their words, a homosexual would be. It was not talked about. It made me feel invisible. However, I come from a place called Kent, a bit like a county or a state in the southeast of England. And Kents were quite different from the rest of the UK. And they wanted to keep Section 28. And so they created their own version of Section 28. And that only stopped in 2010 with the publication of the Equality Act 2010. So my lovely home county really wanted to keep repressing LGBTQIA plus people. And so this is really the area that I grew up in. So I think perhaps that's why I'm quite passionate now about showing representation in materials as much as I can, even though, of course, we are criminalized in some countries. But what kind of effects of this invisibility, of this under-representation, and these are really my own ideas. They probably come from deep within somewhere. But yes, being unseen, the feeling of rejection, feeling shame of who I was, and that came with depression, the feeling of being isolated, fear of being found out, not feeling important enough, and also a lack of self-worth. And this, of course, doesn't only apply to representation of LGBTQIA plus people in ELT materials. This can be applied to all marginalized communities. So disability, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, race and ethnicity, neurodiversity, age, different body types. So there are, we kind of know what the typical representation is in English language materials. And these would be a heteronormative, cis, white, middle class, slim, non-disabled, in a family with two parents consisting of a man and a woman, and usually two children, usually a boy and a girl. But of course, society doesn't work like that. And so that's why there's a lot of us around, with lots of support as well, trying to get better and improved representation in materials and therefore in classrooms. However, my focus is mainly on LGBTQIA plus representation. And there can be a lot of backlash or a lot of pushback on LGBT representation. And the teacher writer Joshua M. Hayes, writing here in 2021 in his book Queering the English Language Classroom, fantastic book, I thoroughly recommend it, not just for LGBT plus representation, I must add. But they wrote that there are three main parts of common resistance. Private life has no place in the classroom. ELT is only about learning language, and speaking about LGBTQIA plus issues is much too personal. These are the common things that I also get on social media. Why should we talk about LGBT plus people? Why should we do that? It's private, but then it is part of who I am. It's part of who we are. I don't teach my students politics. It's not really a political issue. It's an identity issue. But then in his book, Hayes says, well, ELT materials talk about private lives all the time. We talk about families. We talk about dreams. We talk about the body. We talk about secrets. We talk very personal in ELT. And so therefore we already encourage students to open up and be personal. But really, in order to be successful in society, learning a language needs to include all different marginalized communities, including race, gender, sexuality, disability, as just some examples. Excuse me just a minute. And I know you can't see it, but my cat has decided to come and sleep right next to me, and he's snoring a little bit. So I'll try not to be too distracted. So with these hows, this is where I'm going to talk about some different approaches in how we can be more representative in materials and in the classroom. The first one is this, and if people have seen me talk before, you'll know that I talk about usualization all the time. However, I cannot take credit for it. It was not me who thought of it. This has to go to Professor Sue Sanders. She is an incredible person. She is the co-founder of LGBTQ plus History Month in the UK. And she is also the chair of Schools Out in the UK, which mainly focuses on mainstream education. Again, I think ELT is often forgotten about, but we're still just as important. So with usualization, the key factors here is to not normalize. Many people ask me, well, why can't we use normalize? It's a good word. It is, until you kind of flip it over and you think, well, if something needs to be normalized, that kind of implies that it's abnormal. And of course, being LGBTQ plus is not abnormal. It's a very natural thing. It's very normal. I don't really like the word normal, because really, who can say what is normal? We all have our own different ideas and different experiences, different backgrounds. So really, I think normal is just a personal concept that maybe a lot of people try to impose on others. With the usualization approach, people's identities are just that. They are usual. It would show people going to work. It would show people doing hobbies. Gay people do have hobbies. So it's just showing usualness, if that's a word. If it isn't, it should be. And also not to highlight as being special or as being different, because again, that's a kind of othering. So it's putting different marginalized communities on a different pedestal as if they are something to be looked at and wondered at. And that's not what this approach should be. So with this, it's very matter of fact. There's no comment on the character. There's no comment on the identity. But however, it can be a little bit unrealistic, and it may not necessarily represent individuals. But there is another approach that we can also employ, and that is disruption. Again, I would love to claim credit for this, but alas, I cannot. I have to reference here Tyson Seaburn, and if you've seen him talk, fabulous. His wonderful book, How to Write Inclusive Materials, which was published by English Teacher to Writer. I thoroughly recommend that book too. Disruption in this case is a little bit more in your face. It confronts social issues a lot more. So it does highlight the different identities and the different characteristics of marginalized communities, but in a way that is respectful and also that explores maybe why marginalization happens, how it happens, and what can be done to stop discrimination and to erase prejudice. So with this approach, it focuses a lot more on the truth rather than a usualized kind of almost ideal world. But really, there should be a mixture of both of these approaches. And you'll see with some of the examples that I've got, you'll see that I find a usualized approach is quite good to introduce the topic or introduce the subject, and then to extend by going more into a disruptive approach, really examining how marginalization happens. But you do have to be very careful when looking for or trying to represent LGBTQIA plus identities. There are some really quite negative resources out there that maybe don't treat gay people, LGBT plus people as humans, really. One quick example of that is there is a printed book, which I'm not going to name, a discussion book on controversial issues. And one of the questions in there is, would you employ a gay person? Why or why not? And this is a unit about jobs, but the unit is called Gays and Jobs. For one, I have a problem with the use of gays as a noun. I am not a gay. I am a gay person, a gay man. And secondly, does it really matter if a person is gay or not as to whether you give them a job or not? So really, these kinds of questions are written in a way with coming from a background of prejudice and coming from a background of discrimination. And we really need to avoid those if possible. But let me give you a couple of examples of how this might work in practice. So this comes from one of my resources. This is called Daily Life, and it's aimed at CEFR A2. And the grammar point here is present simple, affirmative, and negative. Within this is not the first page of it, but we've already read about someone called Clara, and this is her brother. And her brother just happens to be in a relationship with another man. Within the text, it doesn't mention the word gay. It doesn't mention the word LGBTQIA+. It doesn't have any comment on whether this may be right or whether this may be wrong. It just is. It exists. They exist. We can tell that they are together because the word boyfriend is used. But apart from that, they go on a bus, they live in a flat, they like taking photographs. One of them wants to get a dog, one of them wants to get a cat. So pretty usual things. They just happen to be in a relationship together. Simple. The second example that I've got here comes from my reaction to the unit called Gays and Jobs. I thought, I'm not having this. I want to create a better resource that looks at LGBTQIA+ and employment. And that's what this is called. So this is Sexuality and Employment. I believe it's aimed at B2. And with this one, this looks at a more disruptive approach. So we have a text on LGBTQ+ discrimination in the workplace, and then some discussion questions here, really asking, how do you think people felt? What other kinds of discrimination do you notice in your everyday life? And also maybe some ideas of how to stop discrimination from happening. So in this kind of way, we're maybe challenging students' perceptions of the issues that maybe LGBTQIA+ people face. Again, it's kind of a little bit in your face, but it's not saying that this is necessarily right or wrong. It's just people's experiences, people's identities. And with that, it kind of, for me, it looks a lot more at truth, really. And so these come from these particular things that I have. Obviously, I have to shout about these things because I'm really proud of them. So I've got, on the left there's Existence, which is a PDF of 8 LGBTQIA+ inclusive, there's a lot to say, LGBTQIA+ inclusive resources, and you'll notice I'll show you in a bit more detail one of them. That's comes from my website. Then I've made a little practical guide of how to approach LGBTQIA+ identities in English language teaching, and that's free. And that's something that can be downloaded from my website as well if you sign up to my mailing list. And then a couple of little examples here. Daily life, and love is love, because somebody asked, is there something on Valentine's Day that they could do in their class? So I wanted to have a look at one in more detail, and Martina might recognize this from Harrogate. It was something that I used in my workshop in Harrogate, and this is called family units. One thing that we can all do, I think, when trying to represent different identities is talk about different structures of family. Because in ELT materials, the majority of families are straight husband and wife with 2 children. And it doesn't really cover any other type of family. Now, we know with our backgrounds that there are so many different types of family. There's step parents, step families, single parent or solo parent families, divorced parents, adoptive parents, foster parents, blended families, civil partners, same-sex marriages, and probably so many more that I'm not saying. But also a chosen family. Some places may call this a found family. And this quite often gets attributed to the LGBTQ plus community, because again, still nowadays, there may be children, well, teenagers, who may be disowned by their family for being gay or for being trans or for being bisexual. And so they would need to find a group of people that you would classify as a family. Families can have no children and families can have animals. And with this, I wanted to demonstrate and represent many different marginalized communities. So including age, disability, religion and belief, race and ethnicity, maternity, because again, how many times do we see a pregnant woman in ELT materials? We know it happens because otherwise we wouldn't be here, but we don't see it in materials. There's also examples of non-binary people and trans identities. One thing that I will say with families that have same-sex parents is that I would never refer to it as a gay family or a lesbian family. It's just another adjective that isn't really that helpful. It's not a gay family. It's not a lesbian family. It's just a family. And that's really what we need to remember. So within this particular resource, it goes through grammar, vocabulary, so looks at different vocabulary parts related to family. Excuse me. It looks at definitions and then some sentence completion as well. Then it continues by having a look at a small video. This is an advert. And within the advert, there's a young boy and his two parents, dad and papa. And so it also has some listening practice as well. Different family types. It is quite important when talking about families that maybe some students might not want to talk about their families, or they may be uncomfortable in talking about their families. So there is the option here that they can talk about a family that they know. They can talk about a family that they've seen in the media, maybe on TV, in a book, in movies, for example. Then it goes on to talk about the nuclear family, which actually in the UK is declining. And the differences between a nuclear family and a chosen family. A little bit of grammar, so prefixes, and then some further speaking, again with some, if I can do this, can I? Yes, maybe. There we go, with some more inclusive images. I think with images, this is something that we can all do if we create our own materials or if we get supplementary materials. There are different places where we can get more inclusive images. Some of them, well, a lot of them we can for free. So things like Unsplash, Pixabay, Pexels. There's also the gender spectrum, which mainly looks at different gender diverse people. And also, Can We All Go? Which is it's a fairly small photo library for larger people, because again, and this is something I'm quite passionate about, we don't see larger people in ELT materials. If we do, they're usually sweating, very unhealthy, or they're seen as eating a lot. And so I want to help to change that perception, that stereotype of people with larger bodies. The last page on the family units is a little bit of a writing, and then a task where students can work together. Thank you, Martina. Where students can work together to create a poster about families. And hopefully it would be a lot more inclusive to incorporate different structures of families. So students can see themselves, see their backgrounds represented. And yeah, I think with this kind of resource, which I know is not going to be seen in commercial publications yet, I know that all of these examples that I've shown are not there yet in commercial publications. And that's something that we need to work on. I think the want is there, the desire is there, the need is there, but I think there are lots of hoops to jump through when it comes to publishing. And that's also something I'm trying to help with as well. But when we come to classrooms, I think it's really important to set a scene. And these are my ideas for using sorts of these kinds of topics, these kinds of resources in classrooms. I would often say a governmental guidance is important to look at, especially if you're unsure of what the government's stance is on representing LGBTQIA plus people. I know that in the UK at the moment, that is quite tricky, and in the US as well. I think it also comes down to a whole school approach. So if the school has, or the school or company has an inclusion policy or a statement of commitment, then students going to the school should know that this is the type of topic that you may come across within the classroom. If there isn't a school inclusion policy, maybe a school bullying policy as well. And if there isn't a statement of commitment, a visible statement of commitment, then I would have to ask why. And I would suggest that maybe that might be something to look at. If discrimination is encountered in the classroom, we should try to use it as a teaching opportunity. We can use the moment to give more respectful language, appropriate language to describe themselves and maybe others as well. And also a chance to teach respect for all. And I think this is something that maybe a lot of teachers that I've spoken to are maybe scared of or worried about. What would they do if they heard bad language in their classroom? What would they do if somebody was upset that they were talking about a different identity than themselves? I think it's important not to leave anyone behind. And that is something that I think in all education has been happening for many marginalized communities. And I think it's time that we stopped that. And if you can, to use LGBTQIA plus created materials, obviously there's a dearth of it at the moment. There isn't any in commercial publication, but I am hopeful that things will start to change. I'm almost coming to the end. So if you have any questions, do pop them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll look at my conclusions. So really, including LGBTQIA plus identities in materials and classes helps to erase prejudice. It hopefully would be a safe space for students to explore what different experiences people may have. LGBTQIA plus identities can be represented in ELT materials, and I think they should be represented in ELT materials along with all of the other marginalized communities. LGBTQIA plus students and teachers deserve to see themselves represented. We have been invisible in education for too long, and it does have fairly negative effects on people and their mental health. And finally, LGBTQIA plus identities are not a taboo. They should never be a controversy. They should be talked about, they should be usualized, and they should be visible. I have a few references here. So growing up, just like us, this is the documentary film Misrepresentation, Queering the English Language Classroom, and How to Write Inclusive Materials. And really, that's it. This is a QR code that I think should send you to my website if you want, and you can always contact me if you have any further questions. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook, which is at LGBTQ in ELT, or alternatively, you can find me on LinkedIn. And that's kind of it. And just thank you very much.